Lesson 22, Section 7, Appomattox, Total War Brings an End. During the first years of the war, Lincoln had searched for a commander who was willing to fight the Confederates. The president finally found the leader he needed in General Grant, whom he made commander of the Union forces in March 1864. Grant's views on war were quite straightforward. The art of war is simple enough. Find out where your enemy is, get at him as soon as you can, strike at him as hard as you can and as often as you can, and keep moving on. Using this strategy, Grant mapped out a strategy for ending the war. He would lead a large force against Lee to capture Richmond, and at the same time, General William Tecumseh Sherman would lead a second army into Georgia to capture Atlanta. Grant invades Virginia. In May 1864, General Grant invaded Virginia with a force of more than 100,000 men and met Lee's armies of 60,000 in a dense forest known as the Wilderness. In 2 days of fierce fighting, Grant lost 18,000 men, but still refused to retreat. "I propose to fight it out along this line," he said, "if it takes all summer." He followed Lee's army to Cold Harbor, Virginia, where he lost 7,000 men in 15 minutes of fighting. By the time the two forces reached Petersburg, a railroad center 20 miles south of Richmond, Grant's losses almost equaled Lee's entire army. However, Grant was able to reinforce his army with fresh troops, whereas Lee, who had also suffered heavy losses, could not. Total war. Grant believed in total war on the enemy's will to fight and its ability to support an army. With his army tied down in northern Virginia, Grant ordered General Philip Sheridan to wage total war in Virginia's grain-rich Shenandoah Valley. "Let that valley be so left that crows flying over it will have to carry their rations along with them," ordered Grant. In May 1864, General Sherman left Tennessee for Georgia with orders to inflict all the damage you can against their war resources. In September, Sherman and his army reached Atlanta, the South's most important rail and manufacturing center, and set the city ablaze. The re-election of Lincoln. Any hope of victory for the South lay in the defeat of President Lincoln in the election of 1864. Northern Democrats nominated General George McClellan to run against Lincoln. Knowing that the North was weary of war, McClellan urged an immediate end to the conflict. Lincoln doubted he would win re-election, as Grant seemed stuck in northern Virginia and there was no end in sight to the appalling bloodletting. Luckily for the president, Sheridan's destruction of the Shenandoah Valley and Sherman's capture of Atlanta occurred just in time to rescue his campaign. These victories changed Northern opinions of Lincoln and his prospects for ending the war. In November, Lincoln was re-elected. Sherman's march through Georgia. After burning Atlanta, Sherman marched his army across the state toward Savannah, promising to make Georgia howl. His purpose was to destroy the last untouched supply base for the Confederacy. As they marched through Georgia, Sherman's troops destroyed everything of value that they found. They trampled or burned fields, stripped houses of their valuables, and burned supplies of hay and food. Dead horses, hogs, and cattle that his troops could not eat or carry away lined the roads. The troops destroyed everything useful in a 60-mile wide path, a strategy that was later used in future wars. In December 1864, Sherman captured Savannah, Georgia, and from there he turned north and destroyed all opposition in the Carolinas. Marching 425 miles in 50 days, he reached Raleigh, North Carolina by March 1865, and there he waited for Grant's final attack on Richmond. The war ends. For 9 months, Grant's forces battered Lee's army at Petersburg, the gateway to Richmond. On April 1, 1865, The Union forces finally broke through Confederate lines to capture the city, and Union troops marched into Richmond 2 days later. Grant's soldiers moved quickly to surround Lee's army. Lee told his officers, "There is nothing left for me to do but go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." On April 9, 1865, General Lee, in full dress uniform, arrived at Wilmer McLean's house in the village of Appomattox Courthouse. He was there to surrender his army to General Grant, who met him in a mud-splattered and crumpled uniform. Grant's terms of surrender were generous and enabled Confederate soldiers to go home if they promised to discontinue the fighting. He allowed the soldiers to return home with their own horses and mules, which they would need for spring plowing, and officers were permitted to keep their swords and weapons. Additionally, Grant ordered that food be sent to Lee's men. Lee accepted the terms. As Lee returned to his headquarters, Union troops began to shoot their guns and cheer wildly. Grant told them to stop celebrating. "The war is over," he said. "The rebels are our countrymen again." Touched by fire. No one who fought in the Civil War would ever forget the intensity of the experience. "In our youth," wrote Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., "our hearts were touched by fire." The nation, too, had been touched by fire, with many comparing the Civil War to a great furnace that had burned away one country and forged a new one in its place. In this new country, neither slavery nor the right to secession had any place. Just as Lincoln had said, the Union was a single whole, not a collection of sovereign states. Before the war, Americans tended to say the United States are, but after the war, they said the United States is. These momentous changes came at a horrifying cost. Billions of dollars had been spent on the conflict. With more than 620,000 Union and Confederate soldiers dead, almost every family had lost a member or a friend. Thousands more came home missing an arm or a leg. With 2/5 of livestock destroyed and acres of cropland left in ruins, it would take generations for the South to recover from the environmental destruction wrought by the war. Many historians have called the Civil War the first truly modern war. It was the first war to reflect the technology of the Industrial Revolution: railroads, the telegraph, armored ships, more accurate and destructive weaponry. It also introduced total war, war between whole societies, not just uniformed armies. As devastating as it was, the Civil War left many issues unsettled. The old society of the South had been destroyed, but the memory of it lingered. Thousands of white Southerners clung to a romantic picture of the pre-war South, and decaying plantation houses became shrines. In the years that followed, many in the South would try to recreate their vanished way of life. Secession and slavery were gone, but conflict over states' rights and the status of African Americans would continue long into the future.